Well, I hope that you're doing well today. Maybe you're enjoying the cold weather. Maybe you would like it to warm up a bit. Either way, I hope that you are just as excited as I am to study the Word of God for the next few minutes. We are so blessed, and I hope that we think about that and we thank God for that reality. If you're not doing well, and we don't know who you are, maybe because you just are listening to this video, or maybe you actually go to Eastwood and you're just listening to the video tonight. Let us know. Let us know who you are. We want to be praying for you. We want you to know that we care for you. If we can do anything at all for you, we just ask that you would ask us. We don't have any announcements, so we'll go ahead and jump right in. We're studying the book of Genesis, and we haven't made it far into the book of Genesis. In fact, we haven't even made it to verse 1 yet. For the last several weeks, we've been going through a pretty brief introduction to what we're going to study. I say brief, and I just mentioned the fact that we've been in it for 2 weeks. Genesis is a large book, as we know, so the introduction has been very brief. But remember what we've talked about so far with the introduction. We want to zero in on the patriarchs, right? We want to zero in on Abraham. We want to zero in on Isaac. We want to zero in on Jacob. We want to zero in on all these guys, and we want to know how they thought. We want to know how specifically they thought about God. Well, how can we come to an understanding as to how these patriarchs thought about God? Well, as you might remember, we went through the various names that are used for God in the book of Genesis, and these various names communicate different things to us about God. And then after we looked at that, we moved into, well, okay, now that we have a better understanding of how the patriarchs think about God, how exactly did the patriarchs express their devotion to God? And that's where we left off last week. But you might remember we talked about prayer, right? That is a way that we are very familiar with because we express our devotion to God through prayer. That's at least one way. And the patriarchs also did that. We looked at specifically the some verses that talk about Abraham praying to God, and we noted the fact that Abraham wasn't always happy when he prayed to God, that Abraham prayed his frustrations to God. He laid his worries and he laid his troubles on God. We noticed the very intimate relationship that Abraham had with God through prayer. So prayer is about us connecting more closely to God, and no doubt the patriarchs expressed their devotion to God in the same way. But number two, we noticed the building of altars throughout the book of Genesis. And remember what we said about these altars. What was the purpose? What was so significant about these altars? Well, sometimes sacrifice is mentioned in connection with the building of an altar, right? You think about Abraham and Isaac, and, they go up on Mount Moriah, and Abraham has built this altar, and he's about to sacrifice Isaac, and then, he's told no. And what does he see caught in the thicket? Well, he sees a ram caught in the thicket. So an altar was specifically built for sacrifice, but every time an altar is built in Genesis, a sacrifice isn't always explicitly mentioned in the text. What we know is this was one way that they expressed their devotion to God. This was a way of worship that could be because God had specifically commanded it, or it could just be because they spontaneously desired to worship God. But notice that this period of time in the ancient world, people pledged their allegiance to a number of gods, right? A number of idols. And we see the warning throughout the Old Testament. I am a jealous God. Do not go after these false gods. I am the true God. I'm the one that you want on my side. So we know that people participated in the act of idolatry. Notice the significance that the building of an altar could be spontaneous. If you believed in a particular idol, you had to travel to a particular place where there perhaps was a shrine where you could express your devotion to that idol. You couldn't just do it whenever you wanted to. But notice that God follows his people throughout the book of Genesis, and because of that, they are free to worship him. But then we notice after the building of altars, and of course I'm really going quite fast and leaving out a lot of detail from what we talked about last week. But now we get to the erecting of pillars, right? And we looked at Jacob. Jacob receives a dream from God at Bethel, and then what does he do when he wakes up? Well, he takes the stone that was under his head and he raises it up as a pillar, and we know that the next time he comes to Bethel, he does the same thing. He anoints the pillar. What in the world is this business of people in the book of Genesis erecting pillars? Well, it seems that whenever a person had an encounter with God, they erected a pillar to remind people of what happened at this particular place. This was a place in which a person encountered God. It was a way sort of remembering what had happened. So we talked about prayer, we talked about altars, we talked about the erection of pillars. Well, now I guess we can get into the text of Genesis. So Genesis chapter 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Wow, well it's almost a summary, right? Well, here's what happened. It was in the very beginning that God created the heavens, but God not only created the heavens, God created the earth. So from the very beginning, we see that God is the great creator. Elohim, he is the great creator. But notice, not much is said about the creation of heaven. And this is not an accident, okay? There is a specific purpose for this. It's almost as if Moses, when he is giving us this account as he's composing the book of Genesis, it's as if he's saying, God created the heavens, but you humans, you're not concerned about the creation of the heavens. You're more concerned about the creation of the earth. So let me just get on talking to you about the earth. My Hebrew teacher used to always read it this way, perhaps to emphasize it to us more. And a more accurate reading, of course, is in the beginning God created the heavens. And then there's this transition, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens. Now, as for the earth, and then he would always say, well, I almost said blah, 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 but I want to be more respectful than that. So God created the heavens, okay? But you humans aren't concerned with the creation of the heavens. So let's transition to the creation of the earth. So it's as if we get right to it. And the earth. Okay, well, tell us about the earth. The earth was without form and void. Okay, well, we run into some problems here. And I don't necessarily know if I would call it problems, but a difficulty, I guess, certainly arises, which you might say is a problem. So I'll go with you. What in the world is this business about the earth being without form and void? What exactly does that mean? Well, you might go to a number of translations of the Bible, and maybe they have added something different. Maybe they added a word that is a bit more descriptive. I think we have to take it for what it is. What does it say? Well, it says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Well, okay, when God created the heavens and the earth, what did that look like at the initial stage? Well, when God first began creating the earth, obviously the world needed some form to it. It needed some shape to it because God had just began creating the world. So it's something. I'm sorry, I got distracted. I saw something on the table. It seems like it's just common sense. Now, I bring this up because there are people that like to read science into the Bible because they believe that science is truth, and if the Bible doesn't confirm science, then the Bible can't be true. So some people have the tendency to want to read science into the Bible. And, science is at odds, some want to say, with how, in regard to creation, right? The Bible claims that God created the world. Science claims that evolution was the cause for what we know today as the world and life, all the life that comes with it. So some Christians have become fascinated with the idea of perhaps theistic evolution, the idea that God, kind of set everything up. He sort of set it into motion, and then evolution actually did take place, and evolution created life as we know it. Now, we know the problem with that, right? The problem with that is evolution claims to involve billions of years. So if we're going to claim that God used evolution as the process for creating the world, then we need to find large amounts of time in the Bible. Well, the problem with that is you have to read that into the book of Genesis. Now, here's what some people have said. What some people have said is, well, it's in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And what people want to say is, well, in these first two verses, we have two words used for creation, and because God created the earth, they want to say, well, we're going to find a gap, right? And I know this is a bit confusing, and I'm not doing a good job at illustrating it, but I want us to be familiar with what people might say to us if we're having a conversation about the creation of the world. This is what I'm describing is known as gap theory. Okay, we need to find a gap of time, and people like the gap theory because they don't have to deny that the word day in Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2 refer to a literal 24-hour period of time. So what they say is, well, it is true that God created the world, but then notice that the earth was without form and void. So perhaps God created the earth, and it's as if God just left it there for billions of years and then decided to create again after that, add shape and all that. The problem is that is an argument from silence, and as we know, arguments from silence really don't hold water. How do you argue for something that the Bible just doesn't say? It seems that we need to read it for what the text says, that God began to create the world, and at the beginning, at the initial state of creation, the earth was formless and without void. But notice what God begins to do. He starts to give the world order. He starts to give form, and he starts to give the earth shape. So the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. Well, darkness is something that we probably ought to talk about, because There are several ancient creation epics that talk about the creation of the world, and they are very different from what we read about in Genesis chapter 1. And usually in those creation stories, the being that is creating faces some type of opposition from the chaotic elements of the world. And usually it's from, if you're thinking, maybe you've heard of the Epic of Gilgamesh, opposition comes from the primordial waters that are very dark. So darkness is something that in the ancient world symbolized chaos. But notice that the Spirit of God is hovering over the waters. It's as if this dark, chaotic part of the world cannot rule over God or stop God from doing what God is going to do. In fact, maybe what's being said, the Spirit of God, you might know the word in Hebrew for spirit could also be translated for wind. So maybe there's this aspect to what's being said, that the Spirit is like hovering over these waters, and it can actually blow or move the waters wherever it wants to move them. So not only do we see from the very beginning in Genesis chapter 1 that God is the great creator, but God is the God of all authority. He is supreme. He rules over every being, and he rules over every force of nature. Well, we get to verse 3, and God said. Well, this should signal to us a stage in creation. God said, that's usually how the stages begin. Well, notice, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. So God simply gave a command, and because of his word, things were created, and God saw that the light was good. Well, what we'll notice throughout the days of creation, it's quite customary for God to give a command, for whatever the command is to come into being, and then God gives an initial judgment of the creation. So he says here that this light that comes into being is good. Well, what exactly is meant by the word good? Well, perhaps the word good tells us that there is some aesthetic quality to the light, that the light can be beautiful. It's a thing to behold. Perhaps that's what the word good is getting at. Perhaps what I'm getting at is maybe the word as it's used here is multifaceted. So perhaps another thing that God's judgment could tell us is this is the beginning of how time is going to be measured. We as human beings know that we measure time by light and darkness, usually 12 hours of light, 12 hours of darkness, and that's how time is measured. So I don't know where I'm at. I just got off track. That would not be signaled by the word good. I was going to ask us a question, and I just looked down at my notes and started talking about something else. So perhaps what good is trying to tell us, and what I'm trying to get at, is the creation functioned properly, precisely in the way that God intended, but also it could have had aesthetic qualities. But then also I think the word good is signaling to us that light is going to benefit the rest of the created order. Now, why exactly does God create light first? Well, that's a question for us, and maybe that's a topic of discussion that we could have with other people. Perhaps he created light first, obviously to, well, this seems rather obvious. I shouldn't say perhaps. He created light first to separate the the darkness, right? He wasn't going to allow the darkness to overtake. He allowed the light to overtake the darkness. But then number two, it acted as a way to measure time. But then maybe number three, life needs light to survive and to thrive. So perhaps that's another reason why he created light first. We'll go maybe a little slower next week. I know some of that, just with the time, we need more time to talk about that in detail. So I hope everybody has a great rest of the week. I can't wait to see everybody Sunday, Lord willing. God bless.